we could, we'd welcome our second panel to the table, Representative Tom Tiffany and Ranking Member Jerry Nadler of the Committee on Judiciary. Welcome to both of you. It's good to have you here. Representative Tiffany, again, welcome to the Rules Committee, and I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here today to talk about Resolution 684. And I'll turn my microphone on.
Thank you very much.
HRES 684. Would you like me to begin my remarks?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Second Amendment is one of Americans' foundational freedoms. The resolution before us recognizes our Second Amendment rights. It condemns the unconstitutional order of New Mexico Governor Lujan Grisham that bans New Mexico citizens from carrying firearms in the city of Albuquerque and Bernalillo County. Under the governor's so-called emergency public health measure, violators could face civil penalties of up to $5,000. However, the order has nothing to do with public health and only serves to infringe New Mexicans' rights while not preventing crime or violence. You don't have to take my word for it. New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres, a Democrat, warned only responsible gun owners are likely to abide by the ban. Bernalillo County Sheriff John Allen, another Democrat. This ban does nothing to curb gun violence. The governor's ban makes no distinction between law-abiding citizens and those who break the law. The ban applies to citizens who have passed a background check and undergone the training necessary to receive a New Mexico concealed carry permit. It relies on the misguided idea that criminals are interested in following the law. This ban is not only bad policy, detrimental to public safety, but it is blatantly unconstitutional. The Second Amendment is not a mere suggestion. As the Supreme Court has stated in Konigsberg, the Second Amendment is an unqualified command. In the New York pistol case, just decided a little over a year ago, Americans have a constitutional right to carry a firearm in public for self-defense. It is settled law. In fact, everyone but the governor seems to think it's a settled law, Republicans and Democrats. The New Mexico Attorney General and the Bernalillo County Sheriff have stated the order is unconstitutional. Albuquerque Police Chief Harold Medina said he won't enforce the order. David Hogg, of all people, said there's no such thing as a state public health emergency exception to the U.S. Constitution. Representative Ted Lieu, our colleague, I support gun safety laws. However, this order from the governor of New Mexico violates the U.S. Constitution. No state in the Union can suspend the federal Constitution. The resolution before us today stands in agreement with the statement from these Democrat politicians and left-wing activists. It is a straightforward and common-sense resolution, and it should have bipartisan support. This is a rare opportunity for this body to speak with one voice on an issue where clearly Democrats and Republicans are in agreement. I urge all of my colleagues to support this resolution. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Ranking Member Nadler, you're recognized for whatever remarks you care to make.
Thank you. Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about HRES 684. This resolution does absolutely nothing. It does nothing to prevent Republicans from shutting down the government. It does nothing to promote health and safety. It will not make a single American safer from gun violence, nor does it have any effect on the rights of responsible gun owners. It is plainly a waste of time intended to distract us from Republicans' failure to responsibly govern. Earlier this year, after a mass shooter killed 6 people, including 3 children at a school in Nashville, Republicans fought to make sure everyone could continue to acquire the accessory that shooter used. Rather than taking a stand against gun violence, they chose to stand with the gun industry. Today, we are here to debate this resolution because more Americans and more children have died from gun violence, yet Republicans are steadfast in their commitment to promoting more guns in more places, no matter how many lives are lost. Gun violence continues to take the lives of more than 100 Americans every day. More than 30,000 Americans have died from gun violence so far just this year, including 1,258 children. This past weekend, the nation experienced its 500th mass shooting this year alone. Gun violence is an epidemic that the governor of New Mexico could not ignore in her state. New Mexico experienced 2 mass shootings in May. Then additional shootings killed a 13-year-old girl in July, a 5-year-old girl in August, and an 11-year-old boy earlier this month. Following these horrific events on September 8th, Governor Lujan Grisham declared a public health emergency and issued a public health order that took a number of steps intended to reduce gun violence. The order placed a 30-day prohibition on open and concealed carrying of firearms in cities and counties above a certain threshold of violent crime and firearms-related emergency department visits. In practice, just 1 county met the threshold. The prohibition did not apply to law enforcement or licensed security officers. The order also took several other steps to reduce gun violence, such as requiring monthly inspections of firearms dealers, requiring a report on gunshot victims, and providing every firearm owner with a free trigger lock, among the other actions. On September 13th, a judge issued a temporary restraining order that suspended portions of the order. And on September 14th, even though the order was already suspended and under review, Republicans introduced this resolution to condemn the governor for her effort to reduce gun violence. On September 15th, Governor Lujan Grisham issued a new public health order to replace the old one. Under this new order, concealed and open carry is only prohibited in public parks and playgrounds. This does not include designated state parks. Again, law enforcement and licensed security officers are exempt. And again, the governor has taken other actions to direct additional resources to prevent gun violence. Even though the new order only applies to public parks and playgrounds, Republicans are still proceeding with this political stunt. Apparently, for Republicans, it is too much to ask for even our playgrounds to be free from gun violence. By this point, last Congress, House Democrats had already passed bills to require universal background checks and to close the Charleston loophole, bills that would keep guns out of dangerous hands. We built on those efforts by later passing a federal red flag law, a renewed assault weapons ban, the Protecting Our Kids Act, and the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first major gun safety law in decades. Republicans, on the other hand, are giving us essentially a press release, one that condemns the governor for doing something, anything, to protect their citizens from gun violence. How pathetic. Ultimately, Governor Lujan Grisham's executive orders are a matter for the courts to examine, although unfortunately they will do so based on law that Republicans have repeatedly dragged toward the interests of the gun lobby through radical judges indifferent to the lives lost to gun violence. As Republicans rush headlong towards a government shutdown, unable even to manage the most basic aspects of governing, and as they continue to oppose every action to prevent gun violence, we will continue to fight to make our communities safer for every American. Ultimately, this matter will be decided in the courts. A resolution from Congress is a waste of time and simply diverts Congress from its duties of keeping the government running. I urge my colleagues to oppose this preposterous resolution, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Chair has no questions. Recognize Dr. Burgess for any questions he may have.
I really don't have any questions. I want to thank my friend for bringing this to us in such timely fashion. It obviously is important. I know I've heard from a number of constituents back home in Texas who were terribly worried about what we saw our next door neighbor doing. I will use your statement about, how did you phrase it, criminals are not interested in following the law. That's why they're criminals. By definition, they're lawbreakers. And yet what we do is make it harder for the law-abiding citizens to actually protect themselves from the criminals who seem to be becoming more and more aggressive. So I think this is an important concept, and if you have anything you want to add to that, but I'm grateful that you brought it before us today.
Thank you for your support.
Ranking member is recognized for any questions he may have.
Well, thank you. Just a few. Mr. Tiffany, I just want to be clear. What we have here today is a non-binding resolution. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Right. And so this resolution, does this resolution have any tangible impact on policy in New Mexico or in the United States? Does it change the law in any way?
It sends a clear message that we will defend the Second Amendment to the Constitution here in the United States Congress.
Since you didn't answer my question, I assume the answer is no. This doesn't change the law in any way. And assuming this is passed by the House, will this bill be sent to the Senate?
I can't answer that question. I don't know.
These bills, HRESs, don't go to the Senate. So it would not be. And
I would be hopeful that the Senate would take up a similar resolution and craft it themselves.
And the answer is, if this bill were, if this were passed, would it be signed into law by the president? No, because it wouldn't get there. But what I'm hearing here is that this resolution effectively does nothing. As Mr. Nadler said, it's a press release. Nothing to influence policy, nothing to reinforce safe gun ownership, nothing to protect our constituents from the real threat of gun violence. I mean, if we really wanted to take action, maybe we could consider a number of bills that have been introduced that, quite frankly, would actually protect people from the proliferation of gun violence in this country. But I just want to point out, about a month ago, 110 Democratic members of this House sent a letter to Speaker McCarthy asking him to do something on gun violence, even if he just allows a vote on any of the bills that have been introduced by a number of our colleagues. And I'd like to insert that letter in the record at this point.
Without objection.
And I say this because I hear Dr. Burgess on a regular basis complain about his frustration when he doesn't get responses to letters from the administration and from others. And I share that frustration with him when I think people do deserve a response, even if the response is something I don't want to hear. But we never even get the courtesy of a response, not even an acknowledgement. Instead, what we get is this non-binding resolution, which is really a glorified press release. And it is, to me, an embarrassment. But I would urge my colleagues to please stop talking about this issue unless you want to get real about passing bills that address the gun violence problem that we have in this country. I don't know why Speaker McCarthy can't even, I mean, if the answer is no, the gun lobby won't let me bring a bill to the floor, so that's why, I mean, that's an answer, at least, maybe an honest answer. That's at least something, but not even an acknowledgement. And by the way, it's not just 110 Democratic members. I mean, there are millions of people all across this country who are wondering why, when it comes to this problem, we do nothing. Anyway, I see you on the floor. Yield back.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for any questions she may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I would just like to say, Mr. Tiffany, if you wanted to respond at all to the ranking member, otherwise you don't have to.
I would just give a brief comment in the testimony. Bernalillo County Sheriff John Allen, another Democrat, stated bluntly, this ban does nothing to curb gun violence.
And thank you very much. And I appreciate the fact that you are here in order to protect our Second Amendment constitutional right. And so I appreciate that. Whether or not, it does what, or it has anything to do with what Mr. McGovern was talking about, I think the clear message is that we are here to protect people's constitutional rights. And that's what I appreciate about this. And so I'm fully supportive. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions she may have.
Thank you. So House Republicans are wasting Congress's time with yet another resolution that doesn't address real problems in this country. This resolution essentially amounts to finger-wagging by the House at a state governor over a policy that's already been blocked by the courts and rescinded by the governor. So the more fundamental issue is why the governor and so many of our state and local officials have felt compelled to deploy extraordinary measures to combat gun violence. And the pretty clear answer is because Congress hasn't done its job. Gun violence has reached crisis levels all across this country in red states and blue, largely because of easy, unfettered access to guns, whether traditional firearms, ghost guns, or weapons of war. Gun violence is, as has been noted, the leading cause of death for children in this country. But Congress has failed to act on common sense, constitutional gun safety measures like universal background checks, safe storage laws, and an assault weapon ban. These bills are ready and waiting for action. And I urge our colleagues across the aisle to have the courage and honesty to put these bills on the floor for a vote. As the ranking member referenced, over 100 members of the House have sent a letter to the Speaker asking for a vote, and I joined my colleagues in that letter. Every day, too many Americans die from gun violence. Our communities are safer when there are fewer guns on the street and their use is restricted to responsible gun owners. There are fewer murders, there are fewer suicides, and there's less crime. And the Second Amendment does not preempt many of the laws I have just referenced, which would improve public safety while respecting the constitutional rights of lawful gun owners. The majority of Americans are incredibly frustrated that Republicans in the gun lobby have blocked votes on all of these laws. We need responsible legislators to pass responsible laws to reduce gun violence and crime and to fund the federal government. Those are the bills we should be voting on this week, not this pathetic attempt to distract from the House majority's inability to perform its most basic constitutional duties. I yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for any questions he might have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Ranking Member Nadler, do you think that Governor Lujan Grisham had the authority to issue the original order?
I think so, but my opinion is not important. What is important is that it's going to be settled by the courts in New Mexico, by the federal court there or the state court there, whichever. And Congress has no business passing a meaningless resolution in this respect. The courts will decide.
I'm glad you brought up the courts, because in your opening statement, you said that the situation we're in is due to radical judges, something to that effect.
I did.
So there's only one judge at issue here in this case, and that's Judge David Urias, who is, that's the one who put the stay against this executive order by the governor. Is he a radical judge? Is that who you were talking about?
No, I don't know anything about Judge Urias, who's a local judge in New Mexico. And I doubt it'll stop with him. It'll probably go to the higher courts.
He's actually a federal judge.
Okay, I still don't know anything about him. He's a federal judge in New Mexico.
Well, let me-
Undoubtedly, it'll be appealed.
Well, then this will be news to you. He was appointed by President Biden.
Okay, that's very nice.
Okay. So I
But
just...
whatever he decides, I assume will be appealed to higher courts.
When I heard you say that radical judges, led to this situation,
What I meant-
I thought you might have meant this judge that was appointed by
No, I
President
meant the
Biden.
Supreme Court judges.
Okay. You're calling them all radical?
No, just 6 of them.
Okay. So do you think the judge, this federal judge who was appointed by Biden, erred in his, since you think that Lujan Grisham, Governor Lujan Grisham had the authority to do this, do you think the judge ruled in error when he issued the injunction?
I don't know. I think the higher courts will decide that. My main point is, it's for the courts, it's not for this body. We should be passing a budget. We should be saving the, dealing with the country's budget, dealing with giving disaster aid and giving aid to Ukraine and restoring the child tax credit so the child poverty rate doesn't double. That's what we should be doing instead of passing silly resolutions that have no impact.
So one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle here said that this order was rescinded, and I just wanted to clarify that. It was, the original order may have been rescinded, but it was reissued, and I think you noted this in your chronology.
I think it was a slightly different version, but.
Slightly different version. So it's not been rescinded. This isn't a moot thing that we're voting on.
No, but the courts will decide it. What's moot, what is silly is Congress has no business. And if, my colleague here said that, Mr. Tiffany said that he hopes the Senate will concur in this. The Senate will most certainly not concur in this. Everybody here knows that. And we should be letting the courts decide this question, and we should be devoting ourselves, instead of to silly resolutions, not wasting our time on that. We should be devoting ourselves to the problems in front of this country.
Well, I actually think it's not clear that the Senate wouldn't vote for this, because I believe we may have some House Democrats vote for this. Do you think our distinguished colleague on your side of the aisle, who serves on the Judiciary Committee, who condemned these actions by the governor. Do you think he was in the wrong?
I'm not going to comment on him. I just think it is clear that this will not come up on the floor of the Senate. Why Chuck Schumer would bring this up on the floor of the Senate when they got pressing business, unlike Mr. McCarthy, who seems to think we don't have pressing business, I'm sure he won't bring it up.
Well, they have certain procedures in the Senate that are different than over here, and occasionally members of the minority are able to bring up votes as amendments, and it could be that somehow this does get a vote. And I think it'd be very interesting to see how all the Democrats over there vote. It's going to be interesting to see how Democrats here vote, because at least one of them on our Judiciary Committee has condemned what this governor did. And it's still in effect. There's still a version of it in effect, so it's not been completely mooted or rescinded. Is there a law in New Mexico that allows the governor to ban the carry of firearms in public parks and playgrounds?
I don't know if there's a specific law. I'm not an expert on the laws of New Mexico.
But
what I do know is that neither are most people in this House, and therefore we should leave it to the courts in New Mexico or the federal courts, and we shouldn't be getting involved in this.
I think, there's an issue here that I think is important. There's the issue of the Second Amendment, and I want to get into that later with my colleagues. But there's also an issue of the Constitution guarantees each state has a Republican form of government, and they don't mean that you have to elect Republicans in those states.
Clearly.
Clearly, they haven't in New Mexico. What they mean when they say they have a Republican form of government is that it's similar to the structure of the federal government here, that there are three branches, and you have one branch that's the courts, one branch is executive, one branch is legislative. And in the legislative body is vested lawmaking. That's what I interpret the U.S. Constitution to say when it binds each state to have a Republican form of government. They couldn't have simply an executive who makes the laws and then enforces the laws. That would be banned by our Constitution. Yet, regardless of what you think about the Second Amendment, I think there's a violation here of that directive in the Constitution that each state has a Republican form of government, small r Republican. But let me move on to, well, before we go to that, let me say, I think you said this was a 30-day order in your opening statement, or maybe one of my colleagues over there said it was a 30-day order. I just wanted to clarify. I think it's an at least 30-day order, which the information that I have leads me to believe that. In other words, it's an indefinite order. And the federal judge, to your point, Ranking Member Nadler.
No, this was a 30-day prohibition, not longer than that. I mean, she may renew it, but it's a 30-day prohibition.
But so the judge in this case said the violation of a constitutional right, even for minimal periods of time, unquestionably constitutes irreparable injury. So for us to sit back and say, oh, we'll let the courts sort this out, I mean, if they had received a different decision there in New Mexico, you would have a large number of people being deprived of a constitutional right.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please,
Yeah.
at any point.
What we do here will have no impact at all. It's a statement of our opinion, and that's it. What will determine the rights of gun owners in New Mexico, she put in a 30-day, the governor put in a 30-day order. The courts in New Mexico will decide whether to enforce that order or not, period. What we do here has no impact on that whatsoever.
Well, in our committee, which you and I both serve on, the Judiciary Committee, one of the subcommittee's topic is the Constitution. And what is at stake here is an issue of the Constitution. I've already mentioned that Republican form of government that's guaranteed in the Constitution is
But no one is denying a
imperiled
Republican
here.
form of government. The courts, they have three branches of government. The executive has taken an action. If that executive action was improper, the courts will take care of it.
With all due respect, the executive here is making law. And
Well, the executive is making a ruling which the court will get rid of if the court deems it improper.
I would just say that moving on to the Second Amendment issue here, not just the violation of the base text of the Constitution, but to the Second Amendment. Since the McDonald versus Chicago decision, the Second Amendment has been clearly accepted as a restraint on state governments. Isn't that correct?
Since the New York Bruin decision.
Isn't that correct, Mr. Tiffany?
That is correct.
So the Heller decision guaranteed or asserted, the court asserted that it was an individual right, not some right of the National Guard to keep and bear arms, and it applied to all Americans. But the McDonald decision, which I think was about 2 years later, bound the states to the Second Amendment through, I believe, the incorporation doctrine. So when I first saw this case, I wondered, okay, do we really have a role here? And obviously, I thought back, yes, the McDonald case makes it clear that the Second Amendment is binding on state governments and state officials, like Governor Lujan Grisham. And so I think we do have a role here, even if it is not a binding resolution. I'd prefer to have a binding resolution. I'd prefer to basically enforce this so that the people don't have to wait for years for this case to trickle up to the Supreme Court. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, I think also in your opening statement, you declared that gun violence was an epidemic.
Yes.
So that's concerning to me when somebody uses that language, because Secretary Xavier Becerra, Javier Becerra can declare public health emergencies. Is that correct?
Yes.
So if Secretary Javier Becerra can declare public health emergencies, and you think this is a public health epidemic, and I believe the Surgeon General and Dr. Fauci has said so as well, and you believe that the governor had the authority to do this, do you also believe that Secretary Javier Becerra has the authority to do the same thing and suspend a Second Amendment
No, I don't
federally?
think. No, I don't think that is the case. I think the gun violence, as we've seen in this country, is truly an epidemic. We've seen that. I know that many Republicans and others have said that the reason we have so many mass shootings in our schools, et cetera, is because of mental health problems, which I regard as a slander on the American people, because I don't think the American people are 75 times as mentally ill as people in any other country in the world. We have 75 times as much gun violence as any other country in the world per capita. But it's not defined as a public health emergency. That was a figure of speech. It's an epidemic, but it's not under the jurisdiction of the Department of
Health and Human Services.
Yeah, I was about to say Health, Education, and Welfare, which dates me.
Okay, so it used to be called that.
Yeah.
Okay. So you do not believe that the Secretary of HHS has the same authority to declare a public health emergency and then implement this?
Unfortunately, because our laws do not permit that. Had we passed some of those bills that were passed by the Democratic House last year, we could have gone a long way toward eliminating this epidemic.
Do you think the CDC or HHS has the authority to declare eviction moratorium?
Eviction moratorium?
Yes, like they did under President Trump and President Biden pursued, and then the Supreme Court ruled it was not legal or constitutional.
Well, if the Supreme Court ruled it was not legal or constitutional, they don't have that authority. I'm not an expert on that.
So now you agree with the 6 radical judges?
I wish they hadn't ruled that way, but they did.
I appreciate the back and forth here. I want to give you a chance to respond, Mr. Tiffany. To some of these questions. Did Governor Lujan Grisham have this authority to suspend the Second Amendment?
She does not.
And does she have the authority to make law?
She does not.
And doesn't our Constitution...
And let me qualify.
Yes, please.
She does not unless she is given that authority by the state legislature.
I wonder why, if either of you want to respond to this, why do you think she did this on her own, knowing that she may be struck down by a judge, when in fact she doesn't have that authority? Why not go to the state legislature? Is it particularly partisan legislature? I don't even know the makeup in New Mexico. Is it a Republican legislature?
I have no idea what the legislature is in New Mexico. I think she did it because she thought there was an emergency and was trying to do what she could.
We do have someone here that knows that.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, I'll defer to Ledger Fernandez. Do they have a Republican or Democrat Senate and House in New Mexico?
We have both Republicans and Democrats in the House and in the Senate in New Mexico.
And we do too. I was wondering if you could tell me who the majority was in those two chambers.
In both the House and the Senate, Democrats hold the majority.
Okay.
Wise people of New Mexico have elected. Let me say that again for the record. The wise people of New Mexico have elected Democrat majorities in the House and the Senate.
Well, I don't know any of them, but they were wise to send you because you contribute a lot to this committee. So I wonder, I'm even more perplexed now that I know that Democrats control both legislatures. Yes, Mr. Tiffany, why she did not try to go through the legislature and pass this into law.
I don't know why, but I want to address one component of this. She did it under a public health emergency. And as you know, Mr. Massey, we had a public health emergency that was declared in the United States of America just a few years ago, and we are continuing to dig out from the pain and the consequences of that happening. I think it should concern every American when your constitutional rights are declared to be null and void as a result of a public health emergency. I think it's something very dangerous for our country at this point when you see, in this instance, a governor, when we had just seen this over the last couple years, where a public health emergency is declared to take away the constitutional rights of Americans. We should never allow that to happen. And by the way, there are Democrats in New Mexico that agree with us.
Let me just say, I do not agree that the actions that were taken to respond to the public health emergency presented by COVID-19 took away any constitutional rights from anybody.
Well, the courts in Kentucky disagree with you, Ranking Member Nadler, because our governor suspended our rights to go to church, or tried to, in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, sent state troopers to churches where people were congregating, wrote down their license plates, and proceeded to try and get the local health officials to take action against these churchgoers. And he was soundly reprimanded by the courts. And so there were rights that were suspended during COVID in the name of a public health emergency. And I want to sort of wrap up by saying this. There's a question of whether this should be in front of Congress, or should this be an issue for the courts or the people of New Mexico at the next election. I think it's absolutely incumbent upon us to pass this resolution, because the federal Secretary of Health and Human Services could try something just like this. The CDC could try something just like this. They bandy around words like public health epidemic when they're talking about guns, not a virus. And they're telling you where they're going to go next if we don't nip this in the bud, if we don't vote on a bipartisan fashion. And I do believe this is probably going to be a bipartisan vote in the House, maybe not in the Rules Committee. But it's imperative for us to rule on this by a vote, even if it's just a resolution, to say no. The Constitution does not allow you to suspend basic rights, God-given rights, in the name of a public health emergency declared not by a legislature but by an executive, so that they can, and in the guise of making rules, not laws. And so I urge adoption of this rule that will bring this to the floor, and I also support the resolution itself and the importance of doing so, and I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for any questions she may have for the panel.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Tiffany. Nice to see you again. We've been on a marvelous Codell over the summer. And thank you, Ranking Member. We are the United States representatives. We are Congress. We have federal responsibilities to the American people including those who are either working for the federal government, relying on what the federal government needs to get done, or in states like mine that require that, and depend on federal action. But what we've done in the last few weeks here, when we have incredibly important work to do with regards to funding our federal government, is actually spent a lot of time in this chamber attacking the rights of states under existing law to do stuff. We attacked California last week. This week, we ended up attacking my beloved New Mexico. And the reality is that gun violence is a tragic, tragic matter that affects every single one of our communities. It affects Kentucky, as we all cried for those who were killed in Louisville, and friends of, colleagues of ours and of my extended family there. Mr. Nadler, what is the biggest cause of death for children in the United States?
The biggest cause of death for children in the United States, by far, is gun violence.
And if we want to protect our children, what would be the rational thing to do, given that there are so many deaths by gun in this country?
The rational thing to do would be what the House did last year, passing a bill to require universal background checks on guns, which we had in this country from 1994 to 2004, passing a bill to close the Charleston loophole. These bills would keep guns out of dangerous hands. A bill to pass a federal red flag law so that people who are a danger to themselves or others, according to a court, can't get a hold of guns. A renewed assault weapons ban, and the Protecting Our Kids Act. We passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was a step forward, but a small step compared to what we ought to be doing.
I need to tell you, in New Mexico, we were really welcomed the Safer Communities Act. We received some of those grants, and I think it's really important. I look forward to our state continuing to make progress on gun violence, but it's something that we have to do at the congressional level, and that's what it is. States can do what they need to do. They will handle that, but what we're talking about is what should Congress do? And if we are really concerned about the safety of our children, it is quite apparent what we want to do. And do you happen to know what the American support for universal background checks is?
I think 70 or 80%.
Yes, 70. I think like 90%. Universal background checks are, our communities are asking for that. People who own guns are asking for that. People want to make sure that guns don't fall in the hands of those who shouldn't have it. And the easiest thing is to do a universal background check. Mr. Tiffany, are you a co-sponsor of the universal background check bill that we have in the House that's been introduced in the past or this year?
I am not a co-sponsor of the universal background checks.
Okay, so I think that this is where there are things we can do in Congress that we should be doing, including making sure that we pass a budget and that we have support to actually get not a budget, but appropriations, so that we can continue to do the important work to serve our communities. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back, and thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I don't have any questions, but I do want to just address Ranking Member Nadler. We don't agree on pretty much anything, but today I found something that we're in agreement on, and that's maroon suspenders. We're both wearing maroon suspenders. Mr. Ranking Member, you have incredible taste today with those suspenders, and
Thank you.
it shows if you spend enough time with somebody, you'll find something that you have in common. So with that, I yield back. Thanks, guys.
Well, the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized to try and top that, so for any questions he may have for our
I
friends.
think
on
I
the,
can top
panel.
that. I'll be brief. Yeah, I think it's interesting. My good friends on the left, anytime you talk about gun violence, and any life is one too, any person that dies, whether you're a child or an adult, is one too many. But the answer is always just take the guns away. Make the gun laws stricter. Chicago's got some of the strictest gun laws, and they lead the country in homicides. And never do I hear mention the fact that the 100 to 150,000 young people that died last year from fentanyl coming across the border, unfettered. My good friend from Texas, Chip Roy, was interviewing a witness last week and asked about is he concerned about the rapes of our young children by illegals, and he just didn't care. He just wasn't concerned. It was on his face, which is amazing. I also find it interesting, mental illness is never brought up. And Ms. Nadler, what was your comment? 75% of America?
No. My comment was that it is a slander to say that Americans are 75 times as mentally ill as people in any other country on earth, which is what you're saying if you're saying that mental illness is the cause of all these gun deaths, rather than the proliferation of guns.
Who quoted that number?
I don't remember. I've seen it all over.
See, that's absurd. You're even saying that.
It's not absurd, it's the fact.
No, it's absurd because ask any of the killers in this country particularly that mow down children in schools, they're mentally ill. And who else would do something like that? And I think it's unbelievable. And
Yeah, there are mentally ill people in every society, but in all other societies, they don't get guns if they're mentally ill. Here they do.
Well, that's your answer. Take the guns away. And why is it not working in Chicago?
The reason it's not working in Chicago is what we call the iron pipeline. Chicago does have, and New York for that matter, have very strict gun laws, but criminals purchase guns in states with loose laws, Carolinas, Virginia, wherever, and they bring it up. We don't have customs stations at state borders, so they bring it up to New York or Chicago or wherever. And that's why the local gun laws are ineffective as long as you don't have a national gun law.
So do criminals care about laws, gun laws?
No, the criminals certainly don't, but if you had a national law, you can enforce it. You can't enforce local laws because criminals can buy it where it's legal and ship it into New York or Chicago or wherever.
I just find this interesting. That's always, your answer is taking the guns away. Red flag laws, which, as you're seeing in New York City, to divert the attention away from the police from actually trying to find the criminals and trying to take them off the streets, to do the red flag laws is totally insane.
I'd point out that New York City has a much lower crime rate than, for instance, Bakersfield, California, or most other areas in the country.
Is that because of gun laws? Or?
No, I don't think it's because gun laws. I'm just pointing it out because people often, I've heard many Republicans talk about the carnage in New York. It's not true.
Well, your other comment about public health emergency.
What?
You made a comment about the public health emergency during COVID didn't take away the rights of the individual. I'm asking, was that your comment?
Yes. I'm saying
it did not take the rights.
that the public health measures to prevent the spread of a pandemic, forcing people to wear masks, or requiring people to wear masks, were just common sense and saved, I'm sure, millions of lives.
So that was intent to prevent the spread of the COVID?
Of course.
What about the illegals that you let across the border that you never tested because there is no point of entry? What about them?
Well, you shouldn't be letting illegals cross the border, and the problem is, nobody, not Biden, not Trump, has figured out how to keep them out of the country.
Have they increased since Biden has been in office?
It went down for a year under Trump, and then went right back up, starting under Trump and kept going under Biden.
That's amazing. You're making that statement. Everybody, your own city, New York, is being overrun. Eric Adams is now asking for federal dollars.
Yes, and New York, that's quite correct.
Declaring a sanctuary city to welcome them in, now is wanting federal money, or money we don't have. That's insane.
Well, we have, you're talking about, well, I'm not going to get into the figures. We could afford it. The country can, the city
Oh,
cannot.
the country can afford it.
Yes.
Is 32 trillion in debt a myth?
What?
Is 32 trillion in debt a myth?
No, 32 trillion in debt is not a myth, but if we hadn't passed the Trump tax cuts and we taxed the super wealthy the way we should.
Tax the
you'd
super
cut-
wealthy.
You would cut the deficit greatly.
And the economy must have been, is better now under this Biden administration than it was under President Trump.
Yes, the unemployment rate has come down to 3.6%?
Okay, well, we're going to have to agree to disagree. Ms. Tiffany, I appreciate you following up with this and putting this up. This is, if we don't speak up against the objections of what the liberals are doing all across this country in every office, this is the right thing to do, and I appreciate it. Appreciate you bringing it up, and we'll continue to bring it up. We're not going to let them violate our Second Amendment rights. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Tiffany, am I correct with respect to what we're discussing right now, which was a resolution regarding the governor of New Mexico's unconstitutional deprivation of individuals' Second Amendment rights with respect to an emergency order? Am I correct that the New Mexico Attorney General, Raul Torres, a Democrat, stated he will not defend the emergency order? Are you familiar with that? I think I have indication that from my quote, from my perspective, is an inappropriate application of the Public Health Emergency Act to use that, the power, which is pretty extraordinary, but also very narrowly limited to public health emergencies, to extend that to try and cover an outright ban on the carrying of weapons is, in my judgment, unconstitutional. Does that sound right, that the Attorney General of New Mexico took that position?
That is correct. He went on to say only responsible gun owners are likely to abide by the ban.
Is it also correct that the Bernalillo County Sheriff John Allen, also a Democrat, announced that his department would not enforce the governor's 30-day ban, arguing that it violates the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution? Is that correct?
That is correct, and he went on to say this ban does nothing to curb gun violence.
Is it also correct that United States Senator Martin Heinrich, Democrat from New Mexico, issued a statement that said gun violence is a problem, but said the governor's executive order is an unworkable solution that won't save lives?
You know, I haven't seen his quote, but if he believes in the Constitution, I could see him saying that.
Is it also correct that the relatively left-leaning gun rights activist David Hogg said, quote, "I support gun safety, but there's no such thing as a state public health emergency exception to the U.S. Constitution"?
That is
End quote.
correct.
Do you share the concern by these individuals, regardless of their political spectrum, wherever they fall, that the United States Constitution is deserving of support, and that it would be important for the United States House of Representatives to speak out in defense of the constitutional rights being violated by a governor of one of the 50 states of the Union?
Yes, and I'm glad some Democrats around the country are expressing their disagreement with the governor's executive order.
On a separate point, and I don't have a lot more to add beyond that which my friend from Kentucky articulated very well, but at the core of the issue, and there's some back and forth on this about guns and taking guns and so forth. If you are, for example, hypothetically speaking, a resident of the state of Texas whose house is maybe 120, 150 miles from the border, and if you are, hypothetically speaking, dealing with constant cars that are running through ranches and taking down fences and gotaways, and you're having people's homes getting broken into, and you're having crime that you're having to deal with, when you're dealing with district attorneys in cities like San Antonio and Austin and cities throughout the country where district attorneys are no longer enforcing laws, like, for example, the gentleman who, I use the word gentleman inappropriately here, the man who committed crimes, burglaries, and was let out by a judge with effectively no bail, and then came out and shot and wounded a San Antonio police officer just a couple of weeks ago. Myriad cases like this, increased crime rates, even with some declines in the last year or two from the spikes during COVID, still significantly higher than 2019 pre-COVID, that to the extent that you've got significant cartel operations in South Texas and a continued influx of individuals that we don't even know who they are because of the known gotaways, because of an open border and continue to endanger the United States. The individual in Pennsylvania who escaped from prison after stabbing his girlfriend 28 times in this country, coming here illegally. The young man who was killed on a bus because someone got away and was driving and ran into a school bus on the first day of school, and this 11-year-old boy died in Ohio. The young man who was a supposed unaccompanied alien child was taken in by a father, and the father was stabbed and killed in Florida. I could go on with the crime issues that we're dealing with. When you're removing the ability of law enforcement, for example, in Austin, Texas, or for example, in other states, I'm sure you've had similar situations in Wisconsin, where $150 million is cut from a police department's budget, and the police are no longer able to respond to 911 on a timely basis because of radical leftists running cities. In what universe is it appropriate for the government, in any way, shape, or form, much less by an executive action by a governor unconstitutionally using emergency powers, to undermine the ability of an American citizen to defend him or herself?
I believe it may be inadvertent on our friends across from the aisle, but they are the #1 gun salesmen in the United States of America. And this has been going on now for a couple decades. People will arm themselves. And when you look at the number of women who have chosen to get concealed carry permits and to buy guns, it is skyrocketing, and it's because they do not feel safe.
Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'd like to, if I may, just close with a couple, 3 comments. Your colleague on this dais said we were attacking New Mexico. No, that's not it at all. We're rebuking the governor for trying to deny people their Second Amendment rights. This isn't against the people of the state of New Mexico. #2, we've heard a lot about gun violence today, and the gentleman from Texas just alluded to some of this. We have prosecutors in cities that do not prosecute crime anymore. And I'm going to give you a quick example. In Milwaukee County, in my state, here was his quote from about 15 years ago. Is it possible someone will be killed as a result of a parole or diversion that comes through my office? Absolutely. But that does not change the fact that we should be doing what we're doing to change how we go about prosecuting crime. He's accepting of it. We have prosecutors that don't prosecute crime. You wonder why people commit more crime? We had the defund the police movement. I mean, is it any surprise that that's happened? And look at what's been on all the television stations that I've seen, the cable networks over the last 24 hours, is the officer that was assassinated in Los Angeles. It is open season on law enforcement in America since the riots of 2020. I live in one of the most rural districts that you'll find in the United States. Largest community, 50,000 people. We have had 3 officers in 2023 that have been gunned down. The last one was in just across the border from the Twin Cities, and that person that came out and gunned down that sheriff's deputy was out as a result of a violent crime that they only served 4 years for. We wonder why there's violence that continues to escalate in America. And the final thing that I will say, make no doubt about it, this may be one governor in the United States of America, but there's a whole lot of elected officials around America, in particular on the other side of the aisle, that are quietly applauding this. And that's why this resolution is so important. We need to send the message that we will stand up for the Second Amendment to the Constitution, because if they could take the guns, they will. And all you have to do is look at Australia and countries like that where the exact thing has happened. That is why this resolution is important. We need to stand up for our constitutional rights every day of the year.
And I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin, and I'll wrap up, but I appreciate his sentiments. I would only just underscore your point about other leaders in this country, executive branch or legislative, who would be all too happy to go down the road that we just saw the governor of New Mexico take. And I would note that you are absolutely correct. I would say it probably tends to be my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but no, we need to look in the mirror. There are a lot of Republicans who are all too happy to use the power of government when it affects them and when they're able to use that power. For example, the former President of the United States issuing an award to an individual that advocated for shutting down the largest economy in the history of the world. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further questions to the panel?
I just want to say for the record, I can't believe we've spent all this time talking about a non-binding resolution. I mean, really, with all that's going on with regard to gun violence, with all that's going on with regard to our government about to be shut down, this is how we just spent all this time? I hope you're all proud of yourselves. I yield back.
I'm very proud of the panel, and I'm very proud of myself, and I'm very proud of the bill, and I thank the gentleman for bringing it. Thank you very much. I think I yielded. With that, I'd like to thank the panel again for their testimony, and gentlemen are excused. I'd like to welcome our third panel, Representative David Joyce and Stephanie Weiss, and Ranking Member Rosa DeLore from the Committee on Appropriations. I think they're in the next room, at least or outside.